Picture a serious political commentator, right?
Yeah.
He's sitting on national television, brightly lit studio, all the cameras are rolling.
Standard political broadcast setup.
Exactly. But he is stubbornly wearing a pair of dark sunglasses.
Oh, wow. On TV?
On national TV. The studio lights are giving him a headache, he says. And the crew just wouldn't turn them down.
Right.
So he just sits there looking entirely out of place. And then casually mentions that during the last election, he actually accidentally tried to vote in the completely wrong municipality.
You're kidding.
No. And he got turned away at the desk. It is just, it's funny, it is completely unpolished. And according to the sociologists and commentators we're profiling today, that exact rejection of like hyper-curated robotic political presentation.
That is the key to everything.
Yeah, it's the key to understanding this massive global populist revolt.
It really punctures that hyper-polished bubble we always expect from political discourse, you know? You have a prominent voice casually acknowledging his own fallibility on air. Because in this era where politicians and establishment figures are basically trained to never admit a mistake.
Never show any weakness.
Right. They speak entirely in focus group talking points. So simply acting like a flawed human being becomes this subversive act. It signals to the audience like, hey, I am not part of that pristine manufactured machine.
Which brings us to our mission for this deep dive. Because today, we are unpacking the anatomy of political alienation.
It's a heavy topic.
It is. We are looking at a deeply intense, highly revealing conversation between two prominent Dutch commentators, that's Wierd Duk and Marlies Dekkers, from the digital platform called De Nieuwe Wereld. And through their discussion, we are really mapping out why voters are fleeing the political center in droves, how periods of crisis breed this lingering distrust of our core institutions, and what happens when a younger generation goes searching for meaning in some pretty radical places.
Yeah, and the focus of their conversation is the Netherlands, specifically looking at the rise of a populist party called the Forum voor Democratie, or FVD, and the broader rural uprising happening there.
Right.
But the Netherlands is functioning here as a microcosm. The fault lines they're dissecting, rural versus urban, populist versus establishment, secular emptiness versus religious orthodoxy.
They're everywhere.
Exactly. They are the exact same tectonic plates fracturing societies across the entire Western world. If you understand what is happening in the Dutch provinces, you understand what's happening in the American Rust Belt, or, you know, the French countryside or the British Midlands.
So a quick note before we really jump in, because this deep dive covers some highly charged political content, touching on both left-wing and right-wing ideologies, institutional capture, all of that we need to be absolutely clear.
Absolutely.
We are not taking sides here. Our job today is to act as your impartial guides. We're just unpacking the arguments, the frustrations, and the cultural observations exactly as they are presented in the source material.
Right. We are not endorsing these viewpoints. We're just helping you understand the ideas driving this conversation.
Exactly. So to map an earthquake, you really have to look at the ground where the fissures first open.
And for this specific political shift, that ground is literal. It's happening far away from the parliamentary buildings and the polished city centers. The commentators start by examining this massive rural awakening, which was catalyzed by an event in a Dutch town called Barneveld.
Yeah, so this event was organized by Marianne Zwagerman, who's this prominent media figure and a fierce advocate for rural communities. And the scale of the gathering is what really demands attention here.
How many people showed up?
5,000 people.
Wow.
Yeah, they hit the absolute fire can maximum capacity for the venue. They had to leave thousands more outside.
That's incredible for a local political event.
Right. We were talking about farmers, local business owners, contractors, everyday citizens leaving their homes to gather in this massive hall. And the energy in the room, the way it's described, it wasn't the polite applause of a standard political town hall. It was visceral.
And the mechanism of alienation begins with how this gathering was actually processed by the broader culture.
Oh, yeah. The media reaction.
Exactly. Despite a highly motivated turnout of 5,000 rural citizens mobilizing over fundamental grievances regarding their livelihoods, the mainstream establishment media essentially downplayed it.
They just brushed it off.
Completely. The gathering was treated as a fringe anomaly rather than a major political indicator. And that immediate dismissal by the establishment press is the first profound friction point we need to look at.
Because it sends a message.
Right. When the media ignores a gathering of that magnitude, it sends a distinct message to those citizens. Your concerns are not real news, and by extension, you do not matter to the national narrative.
And there was a guy there, Maurice de Hond, a highly influential veteran Dutch pollster. He was literally sitting on a bale of straw at this Barneveld event, analyzing the room and looking at the data.
Sitting on a straw bale. I love that image.
Very on brand for the event. And his polling indicates a structural, potentially irreversible shift. These rural voters are completely turning their backs on the traditional pillars of the establishment.
The old, reliable parties.
Yeah, the Christian Democrats, the mainstream center-right liberals, the traditional Labor Party parties that have basically run the country for decades. They're hemorrhaging support, and these voters are flocking to local, hyper-specific protest parties and, crucially, to the Forum for Democracy, the FVD.
Which represents a transition from mere dissatisfaction to active, systemic reorganization. The commentators highlight a specific moment to illustrate the energy here.
The introduction of Lidewij de Vos.
Exactly. When Lidewij de Vos, who is this new, rising political figure within the populist sphere, was introduced at the event, she received a reception comparable to a rock concert.
Like standing on chairs, roaring applause.
Yeah, she is positioned as the latest disruptor in a long historical lineage of Dutch populists.
Let's contextualize that lineage for you for a second. They compare her to figures like Pim Fortuyn, the flamboyant sociologist who pioneered European populism in the early 2000s and was tragically assassinated.
Right.
They compare her to Geert Wilders, the firebrand anti-Islam politician, and Thierry Baudet, the founder of the FVD. They also mention Caroline van der Plas, who led that massive farmers' protest movement.
But the commentators argue that the energy surrounding the FVD and its offshoots represents something structurally different than just voting for the next disruptor.
Right. It's not just about winning an election anymore.
No, the structural difference lies in the ultimate ambition. The Forum for Democracy is not merely trying to win a majority of seats in parliament to pass, like marginal tax reform. Their stated strategy is to become a comprehensive movement with tentacles reaching deep into every facet of society.
They want to construct an alternative to the established order from the bottom up. You know, it really reminds me of a tech startup that realizes their enterprise software simply isn't selling to the big corporate clients anymore.
Okay, how so?
Well, the legacy corporations just want to adopt their code. So instead of endlessly tweaking the product to please this unyielding client, they completely pivot. They become a grassroots lifestyle brand.
Oh, I see.
They don't just want you to buy a subscription. They want to be your entire ecosystem. FVD wants you reading their publishing house, using their dating apps, sending your kids to their affiliated alternative schools, socializing in their specific circles.
That ecosystem analogy is highly accurate, and Wierd Duk points out a profound irony in this approach. The FVD is actively adopting the exact same long-term sociological strategy that they accuse the political left of utilizing over the past 50 years.
The long march through the institutions.
Exactly. The theory goes that left-leaning academics and activists didn't just win elections, they slowly took over the universities, the media, the human resources departments, the judiciary.
Right.
But FVD's counter-strategy isn't to recapture those existing institutions. They view them as irredeemably compromised. Instead, they are trying to build a parallel homeland.
A parallel homeland, that's a strong phrase.
Because if you fundamentally believe that the media you consume, the schools your children attend, and the local governments regulating your business are actively hostile to your way of life, a movement offering a complete protective sanctuary becomes incredibly seductive.
But, you know, a sanctuary requires a deeply loyal, fiercely bonded community. And the FVD started as a relatively highbrow intellectual conservative project.
It did.
So how did it morph into a movement with such radicalized, uncompromising loyalty? The commentators trace this explosive psychological shift back to a singular defining global crisis.
The COVID-19 pandemic.
Exactly.
The year 2020 served as the crucible for this movement. This is the precise historical moment the FVD transformed its identity from a standard protest party into a self-identified resistance party.
And the psychological driver was the profound frustration with what the commentators call the pensée unique.
The single monopolistic narrative pushed by the government and uniformly echoed by the mainstream media during the lockdowns.
Right. They specifically point to figures like Hugo de Jong, who was the Netherlands health minister during the pandemic. He became the face of rigid lockdown enforcement.
He was everywhere on TV.
Everywhere. And de Young and the broader establishment presented an absolute consensus. Here is the virus, here are the extreme, unprecedented lockdown measures required, and there is absolutely no room for debate.
It was treated as a matter of pure scientific compliance, overriding any standard political discourse.
Which is crazy for a democracy, right?
Well, the suppression of debate is exactly what ignited the populist views. While the entire political and media establishment marched in lockstep, viewing the crisis solely through an epidemiological lens, FVD figures like Pepijn van Houwelingen and Wijbrand van Haga became the loudest and often only voices pushing back in Parliament.
They were raising questions about the drastic suspension of civil liberties, the immediate devastation of the economy, particularly for small business owners, and the proportionality of the governmental response.
And the handling of Sweden's pandemic response is cited as a prime example of this narrative control.
Right, because Sweden famously took a fundamentally different, much more open approach, avoiding sweeping lockdowns.
In a healthy democratic discourse, you would expect the media and politicians to say, let's closely monitor Sweden's data, let's analyze their economic and health outcomes, and have a rigorous debate.
But
Instead, the commentators observed that the Swedish approach was largely ignored, silenced, or actively vilified by the mainstream press.
which just illustrates a broader failure of democratic mechanics during a crisis. In a state of emergency, governments historically grant themselves exceptional powers, bypassing standard democratic checks and balances.
And the media, feeling the immense weight of the crisis, often aligns closely with the state apparatus.
But when citizens ask, is this proportionate? Look at the mental health toll. Look at the bankruptcy of family businesses. And those questions are met with silence or accusations of being a literal danger to public health. A deep psychological rupture occurs.
It induces a feeling of societal gaslighting. When the establishment suppresses debate on something as monumental as a global pandemic, it sows the seeds for an intractable, permanent public distrust.
But wait, there is a massive contradiction in this timeline that the commentators address, and I want to bring this up.
Okay, what is it?
The leader of the FVD, Thierry Baudet, was actually one of the loudest voices demanding a strict, rigorous lockdown at the very beginning of the pandemic.
Right, before the government even acted.
Exactly. He was furious the government wasn't closing down faster. So how does a movement reconcile that? How do you pivot from lock everything down immediately to we are the fierce resistance against the tyranny of lockdowns without losing your entire base?
It seems totally contradictory if you are looking at it purely through the lens of medical policy. But Wierd Duk addresses this by looking at the underlying psychology of the populist voter.
Okay.
For the followers, the specific policy prescription at any given moment is secondary. The primary driver is the posture of questioning and opposing the prevailing authority.
Ah, I see.
When Baudet demanded an initial lockdown, he was criticizing the government for being negligent and slow. When he flipped to aggressively opposing lockdowns, he was criticizing them for being tyrannical and overreaching.
So the consistent thread isn't the virus at all.
No, the unifying thread is that the establishment is fundamentally flawed, dishonest, and cannot be trusted to manage the lives of citizens.
Wow. And once that core premise is accepted that the establishment is fundamentally dishonest, it creates a permanent resistance mindset. If you believe the government suppressed debate and manipulated data regarding a massive public health crisis, it is a very short leap to assume they are manipulating the narrative regarding everything else. Which brings us to the next major shift. Geopolitics.
Because the distrust bleeds seamlessly from domestic health policy into foreign policy, the commentators argue that the populist right views the official Western narrative on global conflicts with profound suspicion.
They focus heavily on the war between Russia and Ukraine to illustrate this. The argument made in the source material is that there is a complex, historically rooted story regarding this conflict that the Western media simply refuses to tell.
The commentators assert that the West, specifically the U.S., the EU, and prominent diplomatic figures like Carl Bildt or Radek Sikorski, played a highly provocative role over the past 2 decades.
They argue that the relentless push for EU and NATO expansion eastward was a direct, predictable provocation of Moscow.
And to support this, they point to specific, ignored historical warnings. They cite Vladimir Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, where he explicitly stated that expanding NATO to Russia's borders would cross a red line.
Right. And the argument here is not necessarily to justify the invasion, right?
No, not at all. It's to establish that the West ignored flashing red lights for years, driven by a hubristic expansionist policy. Therefore, the Western establishment cannot feign total surprise when the warned outcome actually materializes.
They also bring up a very specific Dutch political event to demonstrate how this geopolitical narrative alienated voters domestically. Back in 2016, the Netherlands held a public referendum on whether to approve an association agreement between the European Union and Ukraine.
I remember this.
Yeah, the Dutch citizens gathered the required signatures, they had a massive national debate, and ultimately voted decisively against the agreement.
But then,
The Dutch government, led by Prime Minister Mark Rutte, essentially bypassed the result. They added a minor interpretive addendum and ratified the agreement anyway.
which is a crucial mechanism of alienation. When you ask the public for their democratic input on a major geopolitical shift and then actively maneuver around their decision when they vote the wrong way, you confirm every populist suspicion.
It signals to a rural voter in Barneveld that their democratic participation is merely an illusion.
It's just theater, allowed by the establishment only when it produces the desired outcome. It links the macro issue of the Ukraine conflict directly back to the micro issue of institutional arrogance.
However, the source material establishes a very critical internal boundary within this conservative critique. While Wierd Duk argues that the West provoked the conflict, he draws a sharp, unforgiving line at how Thierry Baudet responded.
Yes, this is a major point of contention.
Baudet took the contrarian posture to its absolute extreme, going so far as to call Vladimir Putin the hero of our time.
And Duk heavily criticizes Baudet for this. He labels it a massive moral failure and a glaring display of historical ignorance.
Yeah, you can't just say that.
Duk emphasizes that regardless of any Western provocation, Putin operates a brutal, authoritarian regime. Invading a sovereign nation crosses a fundamental moral boundary.
So Duk's critique shows that within the serious intellectual wing of the populist movement, there is an attempt to police their own extremes.
They're demanding a grounding in historical realism rather than just pure contrarian provocation.
And this internal policing leads directly into one of the most explosive parts of their conversation, the hypocrisy lens.
The double standard.
Exactly. Because the commentators argue that when a right-wing figure crosses a line like Baudet with his Putin comments, they are permanently ostracized, demanded to apologize endlessly, and cast out of polite political society.
But when a left-wing figure crosses a massive historical or moral line,
the argument is that they are entirely forgiven and reintegrated into power. They refer to these gatekeepers of forgiveness as the leftist high priests.
This concept of the leftist high priests is central to understanding the furious resentment of the populist right. The source provides a litany of specific historical examples to illustrate this perceived double standard.
Like who?
Well, they point to Paul Rosenmuller, a highly prominent left-wing Dutch politician who, during his youth in the 1970s, expressed admiration for the murderous Pol Pot regime in Cambodia.
Which is just wild to think about.
Right. They mention Wierd Duk, deeply associated with radical left-wing activist groups. They bring up Jesse Klaver and Diederik Samsom, mainstream progressive leaders who, in their early careers, were involved in radical environmental activism.
Activism where, allegedly, materials for a bomb were found in a shared activist office space.
Exactly. And the commentators even bring up the deepest open wound in modern Dutch politics, Volkert van der Graaf.
The guy who assassinated Pim Fortuyn in 2002.
Yes. The source expresses profound, lingering disgust that a left-leaning judiciary refused to classify the assassination as a political terrorist murder. This allowed him to eventually walk free, run marathons, and live a relatively normal life.
So the contrast they draw is stark. A left-wing activist can literally assassinate a political rival and eventually be reintegrated into society, while right-wing politicians are treated as permanent, existential threats to democracy for bad tweets or controversial associations.
But how does this double standard actually operate? Is it a smoky back room where judges and journalists plot against the right?
Right. Is it a conspiracy?
The commentators argue it is more systemic and biological than that. It is the result of institutional capture. Think of the institutions of society, the media, the judiciary, the education system as an immune system.
Okay, an immune system.
The underlying culture of that immune system is progressive. When a left-wing activist breaks the law, say by chaining themselves to a coal plant or expressing radical Marxist views, the institutional immune system views it as an allergic reaction.
Like a rash. Annoying, but not deadly.
Exactly. It's viewed as part of the same organism, sharing the same underlying goal of a utopian future. They are viewed as misguided idealists. They are granted absolution.
But when a right-wing populist emerges, the immune system reacts entirely differently.
Completely. When a right-wing movement gains traction, the progressive immune system views it as a deadly foreign virus. The goal is not to manage it or forgive its excesses. The goal is to completely eradicate it.
They view right-wing transgressions not as youthful idealism, but as fundamentally rooted in historical evil.
Exactly.
If you are a conservative voter and you realize this is how this system operates, it changes your entire strategy. If you know that apologizing for a misstep won't earn you forgiveness but will simply be used as a confession to destroy you further, why would you ever apologize?
You wouldn't.
This perceived hypocrisy creates a terrifying feedback loop. The right realizes that moderation and appeasement do not work because the institutions aren't looking for an apology, they are demanding a surrender.
So instead of moderating, they lean heavily into provocation. If the game is rigged, the only power you have is to flip the board and disrupt the game itself.
Which leads us to the generational consequences of this disruption, because this perceived hypocrisy has led the newest generation of these populist movements to actively dismantle old moral boundaries, almost purely as an exercise in testing the system.
We are witnessing a massive generational shift in what constitutes a moral anchor.
Yeah, for the older generations, particularly the post-war generation of baby boomers, the moral anchor of Western society was absolute and unquestionable: World War II and the Holocaust.
That was the ultimate, universally agreed upon representation of human evil.
Right. If a political movement flirted with anything even remotely resembling ethno-nationalism, fascism, or anti-Semitism, they immediately placed themselves outside the bounds of civilized discourse. That was the hard boundary that held Western politics together.
But the commentators observed that the new generation youth who have grown up through the 2008 financial crisis, the isolation of the COVID lockdowns, and what they perceive as endless media manipulation, is approaching history with a staggering level of skepticism.
Because they have been taught by these populist movements to question the official establishment narrative on public health, climate change, geopolitics.
And so they are now applying that same radical skepticism to everything, including established historical facts like the Holocaust.
Which brings us to a deeply controversial and dark element of the FVD's strategy. The source material points out that the youth wing of the party has actively platformed extreme ethno-nationalists.
Yes, they have published articles featuring or praising individuals like Jared Taylor, a well-known white supremacist.
And they've shown admiration for figures like Nick Fuentes in the U.S., who has openly engaged in Holocaust denial and virulent anti-Semitism.
Marlies Dekkers attempts to contextualize this behavior sociologically. She suggests that for many of these youth, this might not be driven by genuine, deep-seated ideological hatred.
Then what is it?
She posits it is a new form of punk. It is extreme meme culture. It is a generation rebelling against the sacred cows of the boomer establishment purely for the sake of shock value.
I see.
They know exactly which symbols and historical events offend the progressive establishment the most, so they wield those specific ideologies as weapons to get a reaction.
But Wierd Duk pushes back on that theory with intense clarity.
Yeah.
He argues that you cannot simply wave away the mainstreaming of Holocaust denial or ethno-nationalism as brutal memes or edgy youth rebellion.
Right. He states that if a political party is going to feature people with these ideologies in their official magazines or place them on their local voting lists, they cross a definitive, dangerous line.
He demands that politicians be forced to clearly articulate their positions. If your ideology is extreme right, you must own that label. You cannot hide behind the shield of irony claiming it's just a meme to dodge accountability.
This phenomenon highlights the danger of the boy who cried wolf dynamic in political media. If mainstream media and left-leaning institutions spend a decade labeling standard, mainstream conservative policies like desiring stricter immigration or lower taxes as fascist or extreme right, the words are entirely stripped of their historical weight.
So when actual literal extremists emerge, like Taylor or Fuentes, the youth simply shrug.
They think, the media called my parents fascist for wanting a secure border, so if they call these guys fascists, it's probably just more establishment fake news.
It's the complete memification of radicalism. It neutralizes the societal alarms that are supposed to warn us of danger.
And if we pull on that thread, we arrive at a terrifying psychological concept: epistemic collapse.
Epistemic collapse. What does that actually look like in a normal person's day-to-day life?
It is the breakdown of a shared reality. In a functioning society, we might fiercely disagree on how to tax income, but we agree on the basic data of how much income exists.
We agree on the crime statistics, even if we disagree on policing.
Exactly. But in an epistemic collapse, we lose the shared gatekeepers of truth. We no longer agree on the basic documented realities of the world.
Give me an example.
If a state-funded meteorologist issues a severe weather warning saying a hurricane is coming, a citizen experiencing epistemic collapse won't just ignore the advice. They will actively walk outside into the storm purely because they believe the state meteorologist is part in a corrupt apparatus trying to control their movement.
Wow.
When you lose that shared reality, everything, from public health to historical atrocities, becomes merely a narrative to be deconstructed.
And once you deconstruct all societal norms, all historical truths, and all establishment narratives with endless memes and skepticism, what are you left with?
You are left with a massive echoing psychological emptiness.
And nature abhors a vacuum. This brings us to the search for meaning, because this youth rebellion isn't just about economic policy or voting districts. It is deeply, profoundly spiritual.
The commentators observe a very clear trend emerging from this vacuum. Young people, finding the traditional Western, secular, hyper-individualistic culture to be chaotic, exhausting, and devoid of transcendent purpose, are desperately seeking out rigid structures.
They are looking for something that demands discipline and offers clear, unyielding rules.
Right. They note a return to highly traditional Orthodox Christian churches, the formation of alternative, tight-knit faith communities, and increasingly and significantly, conversions to Islam.
The conversation in the source then shifts to a highly controversial, polarizing topic: the rapid Islamization of Europe.
Yes.
The commentators argue this is not merely a demographic shift based on immigration, but an active cultural conquest occurring while the secular West is essentially asleep at the wheel.
They cite specific examples that fuel the populist outrage. The grooming gang scandals in the United Kingdom, which they argue were systemic abuses covered up by local authorities for fear of being labeled racist.
They mention police forces in uniform attending Islamic iftar meals, which they view as a capitulation of secular authority.
And political parties like Denk in the Netherlands, a party primarily supported by voters of immigrant descent, which they argue actively tries to blur the fundamental Western boundary between church or mosque and state.
To underscore the perceived gravity of this cultural shift, the source brings in the perspective of the new Hamidian.
Right, the Iranian model.
Yeah, she lived in Iran until she was 26 years old. She vividly describes the reality of living under a strict religious regime, being arrested by the morality police as a teenager, simply for being deemed immodestly dressed, being thrown into holding cells, enduring abuse.
She eventually escaped to the West and built a successful life, but her observation of Europe is chilling.
She looks at the current cultural trajectory, the appeasement of radical Islamic elements by Western progressive institutions under the guise of tolerance, and she states, "When I look at the future of Europe, I see the current state of Iran."
That is a staggering, heavy statement.
It is, and she is not a solitary voice. The commentators mention other prominent women of minority backgrounds, figures like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Lale Gül, and Asita Kanko.
These are women who have intimately lived under or fiercely fought against strict Islamic conservatism in their own lives. They are practically screaming from the rooftops, warning the secular West that it is voluntarily surrendering its hard-won cultural freedoms, women's rights, and freedom of speech.
Yet, according to the source, these women are frequently ostracized, ignored, or even labeled as bigots by the progressive left for daring to speak out against a minority religion.
This dynamic exposes a massive cognitive dissonance in modern progressive politics. You have progressive left-leaning institutions, LGBTQ+ advocates, and modern feminists fiercely defending religious conservatism, specifically Islam, under the banner of multiculturalism and intersectionality.
Even though the strict tenets of that religious conservatism fundamentally oppose every single core value of modern feminism and gay rights.
Exactly. The commentators view this as a paradox that leaves the political center completely paralyzed, unable to defend its own secular liberal values.
This paralysis has led to one of the most bizarre and fascinating political realignments of our time: the Horseshoe Theory Alliance.
The Horseshoe Theory. It's fascinating.
The source explores how far-right, traditionalist populists like Thierry Baudet are actually finding strange common ground with conservative Islam. On the surface, you would think European ethno-nationalists and Islamic conservatives are mortal enemies.
Ideologically, they should be. but practically they share a profound unifying rejection of the modern Western structure.
Right. They are both fiercely anti-woke, anti-secular, and anti-liberal.
They both frequently reject modern American capitalism and its hyper-individualism. They both desire a society structured around strict traditional gender roles, the primacy of the family unit, and ultimately submission to a higher, unquestionable authority.
Let me push back on the commentators' framing here for a moment, though. They seem to operate on the deeply pessimistic assumption that in any cultural clash, the radical elements inevitably win out over the moderates.
They point to Iran as a historical example where a radical, highly motivated minority subjugated a moderate, secular majority.
But is that actually a historical inevitability? Or is that just the anxiety of commentators who feel they are losing control of the cultural narrative?
It's a critical question. The belief that radicals always win is rooted in a sociological concept known as the asymmetry of conviction.
Asymmetry of conviction.
Think about the energy levels required for different political postures. The moderate centrist citizen wants to finish their shift at work, go home, pay their mortgage, watch some television, and maybe grill in the backyard on a Sunday.
They just want the system to function quietly.
Right. The radical, however, is entirely consumed by their ideology. They are willing to lose their job, alienate their family, go to jail, and dedicate every waking second to reshaping civilization.
So when the moderates' desire for a quiet weekend meets the radicals' relentless desire for revolution,
The moderate will compromise just to make the yelling stop. The radical never compromises. Therefore, the radical usually ends up dictating the terms of the cultural surrender.
that makes a lot of sense.
Furthermore, the commentators touch on the psychology of the word Islam itself, noting that it literally translates to submission.
Right.
When the secular, hyper-individualistic world feels exhausting, chaotic, and devoid of intrinsic meaning, the idea of simply surrendering the burden of endless choice to a higher, unyielding order becomes an incredibly seductive psychological relief for a weary generation.
So if the youth are turning to radical extremes or rigid orthodoxies for meaning, and the working-class rural voters are fleeing to populist movements for protection, what is actually left of the traditional political center?
According to the commentators, the answer is absolute zero. The middle has collapsed.
The source reserves some of its most precise and harsh criticism for the establishment figures who they believe actively destroyed the center from within. They explicitly name Mark Rutte, the extraordinarily long-serving former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, and Hugo de Jong, the former Health Minister.
They refer to these men as the grave diggers of the middle.
Grave diggers of the middle. Ouch!
Rutte, they argue, governed primarily through extreme pragmatism, normalizing political lying and memory lapses to such an extent that the fundamental currency of democracy trust simply evaporated.
And de Jong is cited for his sheer arrogance and technocratic overreach during the pandemic.
The argument is that when the center is ruled by technocrats who lie, obfuscate, or act with impunity, the center loses all moral authority to govern.
And what is taking the place of those old establishment pillars? The commentators describe the current political middle as an entirely empty vessel, devoid of any ideological soul.
They point to younger centrist politicians like Rob Jetton, a prominent progressive liberal figure.
Right. They argue that politicians like Jetton try to look sexy and culturally relevant by engaging in PR stunts like wrapping themselves in the Dutch flag or participating in highly curated photo ops, but offer absolutely zero substantive vision to a generation that is struggling to buy a starter home or find stable employment.
It is a politics of pure aesthetics.
And that lack of substantive vision has devastating real-world consequences. The source emphasizes that the populist anger is not just theoretical. People feel literally, materially robbed by the establishment center.
They feel their physical land and generational farms are being taken away by sweeping technocratic environmental regulations like the European Green Deal.
They feel their small businesses are being crushed by complex tax codes designed for massive corporations. They feel their future security is being gambled away, pointing specifically to controversies over new, highly complex pension systems.
They note that even supposedly right-leaning conservative politicians like Joost Eerdmans of the J21 party eventually compromised with the establishment on these pension reforms.
Which deeply angered their base, who viewed it as a betrayal.
Exactly.
So if you are listening to this, analyzing the political landscape, and you're thinking, okay, the middle is dead, the establishment technocrats are corrupt and arrogant, and the extremes are taking over with radical, unforgiving ideologies, what is a voter supposed to do?
Are we just passengers on a ship, analyzing the structural integrity of the hull while the water rushes in?
Do the commentators locate any potential alternative compasses? Any models of leadership that might navigate out of this?
They do identify a few rare examples, though they admit they are scarce. Looking internationally, they mention United States Senator Marco Rubio.
Okay, Marco Rubio.
They contrast him with someone like J.D. Vance. In their view, Rubio represents a politician who attempts to maintain a principled, consistent, professional stance.
The bridge.
Yes, someone who tries to channel the legitimate, raw energy of the populist working class without descending into the chaotic, destructive meme culture or extreme, inflammatory rhetoric of the furthest Magier fringes.
And what about in the domestic Dutch context?
They point to Mona Keizer, a Christian democratic politician. They praise her for possessing an intuitive, deeply grounded moral compass.
She was the one fired from the cabinet during the pandemic.
Exactly. She was fired for publicly speaking out against the government's own lockdown measures and the implementation of vaccine passports, which the commentators view as an act of immense, rare political bravery.
But even as they praise her, they immediately acknowledge the tragedy of the current cultural moment. They admit that the radicalized youth, swimming in a sea of edgy memes and extreme ideologies, will likely just dismiss someone like Mona Keizer as a boomer.
They will view her principled, polite conservatism as hopelessly out of touch with the apocalyptic energy of the present crisis.
Which synthesizes the absolute core lesson of this entire sociological deep dive. Trust is a fragile mechanism.
It takes decades to build, it is incredibly easy to break, and it is almost impossible to rebuild once shattered.
When the political establishment acts with unchecked arrogance, when it creates blatant double standards for who gets forgiven and who gets destroyed, and when it routinely breaks its own rules, it completely forfeits the moral right to demand compliance from its citizens.
You cannot win back a deeply alienated, cynical, financially stressed public with flag-waving photo ops, celebrity endorsements, or slick PR campaigns.
The only path forward, the only way to rebuild the center, is through radically honest, deeply principled leadership that actually listens to the pain of the populace without dismissing them as deplorable or fringe.
And right now, as the conversation bleakly concludes, that kind of leadership appears to be in critically short supply across the Western world.
Let's take a breath and recap the immense, complex territory we have just mapped out today. We started on the ground, with thousands of rural voters in Barneveld standing shoulder to shoulder, demanding to be seen by an establishment that treats them as invisible.
We traced how the uncompromising lockdowns of 2020 acted as a massive accelerant, turning debates over health policy into a fundamental war over civil liberties, bodily autonomy, and institutional trust.
We explored the devastating psychological impact of the leftist high priests, the institutional immune system that forgives radicalism on the left while seeking to eradicate populism on the right.
We saw how that exact double standard drove a new, cynical generation to wield extreme, taboo ideologies as meme weapons, risking epistemic collapse just to burn the hypocritical system down.
And finally, we looked at the massive spiritual vacuum left behind, where young people are turning to rigid orthodoxies and rapid Islamization to find the structure and meaning that the hollowed-out, secular political middle is entirely incapable of providing.
It is a profound structural unraveling of the post-war Western consensus, and it brings us to a deeply resonant, almost melancholic thought from Marlies Dekkers at the very end of their discussion.
She looks at her own generation, the baby boomers, the older generation currently holding the levers of cultural and political power, and she labels them a guilty generation.
They are not guilty of starting a global war, but guilty of a massive historical abdication of duty. Her generation enthusiastically broke away from the old restrictive traditions, the churches, and the strict moral codes.
But having torn down the old house, they completely failed to build or pass down any new sustainable values, norms, or moral anchors. They left the philosophical house entirely empty, forcing the youth to go wandering, searching for meaning and boundaries in the dark.
And as we have seen throughout history, when a generation is forced to search for meaning in the dark, they often end up finding monsters.
Which leaves us with one final, deeply personal, provocative thought for you to consider as you step back into your day.
If the alarming rise of radical movements, whether it is ethno-nationalism on the fringes of the right, or the rigid religious extremism filling the cultural void, is simply a symptom of a society that has forgotten how to explain, defend, and cherish its own underlying values. What is one core value you hold?
What is one fundamental democratic or human value that you could clearly, passionately, and convincingly defend to the next generation today without resorting to irony or political talking points?
Because the lesson from Barneveld, from the lockdowns, and from the fractured youth is absolute. If you do not give the next generation a clear moral compass, someone else with a much darker ideology absolutely will.
And on that note, we want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Whether you are listening in a high-rise in the city center, driving a tractor in the country, or navigating somewhere in the vast, complicated space between, keep questioning the narratives, keep listening to the people around you, and we'll see you next time.